So my brother Rob and I took my mom on this trip. We have a place back in Montana, and there was this great vista where you could see down, I don't know, thousands of feet into this gully. And when we pulled into this scenic point, I didn't realize at first that the parking lot that we were pulling into actually dropped down to another parking lot where you'd rest your car and look over the vista. And I didn't realize because I'm in this big Suburban, and as you're getting close to it, it just looks like the edge falls off and you're at the end. So I realized when I finally saw the parking that the people in the back seat couldn't see now what I saw, which is there's another parking lot below us. So my mom's in the back seat. She was in her 80s, and she says, Paul, don't get too close. She says, she goes, this is way too close. You should be more careful. And so I stopped the car. I go, okay, Mom, we'll stop here. And then finally she goes, I'd just like to go. I feel really nervous about this. Again, not knowing there's this real parking lot down below. So I put my hand up on the back seat. I look backwards, but I put the car in drive instead of reverse, step on the gas, go over the edge. And my mom screams out, I'll never forget this. She says, you effing moron, you killed us. And I'm like, Mom, the last thing I would have heard from you was a effing moron. And in any event, I think that's a little bit of what's happening today with the Trump administration. All of us are in the back seat, and we don't know if he's playing a joke on us or if we're seriously driving off the edge. But today we're going to talk about a lot of those issues we should have some fun with. Hello, I'm Paul Johnson with New Frontiers. I'd like to welcome you back to this edition where we're going to have three members of our panel that are going to be talking about the current events that are taking place today. We've got a bunch of them. We're going to talk about what happened at Columbia University and the expulsion of Mahmoud Khalil, who lost his green card. We're also going to talk about the issue of the Senate budget resolution. And then we're going to talk about the economy in general. We'll be giving you some slides that give you an indication of what's happening. Now, I can tell you that whether I agree or disagree with the administration, I really believe that it's important for all of us to have a sense of agency. Part of what we're trying to do here is to explain these issues in a way or a format that gives you kind of upsides and downsides by listening either to different people's opinions or different opinions that we might have on either side of the issue. Now, I'm Paul Johnson. I'm just an ordinary, optimistic American who genuinely believes that the United States is still a great cause for good. If you like what it is that we're doing, push that subscribe button and we'll get going with the show.
Destiny. Destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. 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 You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Let me welcome my guest first, Henry. Henry, thanks for being on the show. I appreciate you being a longstanding guest and kind of a partner in this podcast.
Great to see you, Paul, and thanks for the joke. I like that one.
Yep. And then Bob Robb, my favorite columnist. He's on Substack. You can find him there. We take a lot of our content from things that he's written. He's very good at being able to frame an issue, give you a lot of data, give you a lot to think about. He comes at it from a conservative point of view, whatever that means anymore. But in any event, Bob, thanks for being here with us today.
Always good to be with you.
All right, so I'm going to start with one that I'm really interested in hearing both of your opinions and see if you disagree with me on this one. And this is about the story of Mahmoud Khalil, who is the student who went to Columbia. He has a green card. I believe he has a family that's located here. And Donald Trump revoked his green card last week and went to ship him out. And instead, he's sitting in a jail waiting for a trial to take place. Now, interestingly enough, as I thought about this, I tend to err towards free speech. I believe free speech is really important, but I don't quite see this one as a free speech issue. And here's my logic to this. First, these guys broke into Hamilton Hall. Second, they destroyed property. After destroying property, they utilized this guy, Mahmoud, as the spokesperson to negotiate a deal as to when they would come out. Now, in addition to that, he may be or may not be supporting Hamas, which is what's being utilized by the administration. But for me, if you can justify the idea that Mahmoud was simply utilizing his free speech issue, then I wonder why we couldn't utilize that to say the people on January 6th were just using theirs, right? They showed up, they occupied a building, they threatened the people that were inside of it, and they effectively were in a position doing something that they knew was illegal. Now, Mahmoud has the additional upside or downside of being a green card holder, meaning if it were up to me, I would have put people in jail that were at January 6th. And we did. Our judges put many of them in jail. They may have gotten a pardon, but many of them served time. If you ask me, many of the students who were destroying property at Columbia, they should have served jail time for that. But short of that, if you're here on a green card, I don't see that as a good excuse. I don't see free speech as being a good excuse for why you should get away with it. Love your guys' opinion on that.
I somewhat disagree with a caveat. I believe that there were crimes committed in the occupation of Columbia. He has not been charged, much less convicted of any crime. And certainly there is a process for revoking a green card and deporting the individual under our federal statutes. There's a process dictated, and before that happens, he has to go before an immigration court for a judge to decide. And in his particular circumstances, I don't see why, even if the administration wanted to pursue deportation of him, that he needed to be detained and removed from his family and incarcerated in Louisiana with limited access to a lawyer to which he's entitled under the federal statutes. So I think at a minimum, the approach to his case was unjustified based upon the facts that we currently know. But we don't know all the facts. And there have been some allusions that in addition to espousing pro-Hamas positions and points of view, that he represents a national security threat of some sort. And if that were the case, if there was some substance to that, then I could understand the detention rather than simply go through the process that's provided for in federal statute for revoking a green card and deporting the holder of it.
Yeah, I agree with Bob, actually, that I think this is going to have to be played out through the courts to find out exactly what this chap was up to at Columbia, whether the student organizations that he was part of were indeed in some way aligned with Hamas, whether there's anything to these claims that he's a national security threat. That's going to have to all be hashed out through the courts, along with any other questions of some sort of civil suits against him for destroying property, etc. That's all going to have to go through the courts. I think another sort of broader question, I've been an international student myself. I'm an international scholar. I'm from New Zealand. I studied in Germany and in the US and in the UK. I really do ask myself why these international students would be engaging in this kind of protest, violent protest going on for so long. When they come to America, because we have the best universities in the world, that's why I came to America, and they're not studying. In this case, they're spending weeks or months protesting for various causes, etc. I don't think it's really what the international education mission of the university is for. Obviously, international students add to our discourse here. We learn about foreign countries from them. I hope that I can educate Americans about my country and about other places I've lived. But I do think that this has gone beyond a point of reasonable discourse when they're destroying property and breaking into halls. And so I think that shedding light on these cases, obviously this has to follow the rule of law, but to inquire into exactly what's going on with the student organization that he was part of, to maybe raise the question of whether student organizations should be so closely aligned with terrorist groups' goals in their public statements, etc. I think it's potentially a good conversation to have, and maybe to just alert university leadership and students that are applying to come here that The universities are there to do serious work and serious scholarship and research, not to be treated as platforms for people's pet political projects.
Yeah, I think we have far too many geniuses going into political science and not nearly enough going into engineering and business, if you ask me. That seems to me to be part of the problem. But I also look at this. I take heed from what Bob said. There's a due process, and the whole idea of the United States is we should follow a due process. It seemed to me Trump would actually do himself more favors by looking at prosecuting them for this, putting them, holding a trial and saying, hey, was this legal activity? And that in itself, my guess is you'd get a number of people who held green cards that just decided this wasn't the place they wanted to be anymore. But nonetheless. All right, so let's jump over to the economy. I'm going to put up some slides, and we're just going to take a minute to go through these. I'm going to do it because I think there really is some mixed information that we're getting on the economy, and I think there are some things that we should look at and that we should think about to make certain that we have some self-agency in this. But let's start with the first slide. All right, so let me start with telling you where I got these slides. I read The Economist, The Wall Street Journal. I like both of those publications. I love The Economist because they take a look at what's going on in the United States almost from an outside perspective. But again, these slides came from The Economist, and you can, if you pick up a copy of it, you can find the article that's on there. They did a great job of kind of describing this and being fair and balanced in it. What you see, though, in this first slide that's interesting is the S&P 500. You can see on the slide Biden, it all starts on the far left at election day, which equals 100. All four of these particular terms start right there. You can see the one that scored actually the best in the market ended up being Biden. And then after that one, you have Trump's first term, although he did take a downturn, although I think, to be fair, a lot of that was driven by COVID. And you can see Obama that is below that. Now, the red line is what's happening with Trump's current term. And there's a real crash that has taken place here in the marketplace itself. Now, we'll talk a little bit about this whole idea that we're hearing from them about Main Street versus Wall Street. But the market's lost about $5 trillion, and that's an evaporation of wealth that's going to have an effect on how people see things and investing in things moving forward. Here you can see consumer prices. And this is the increases that happened from a year earlier. You can see that the first Trump administration, the increases in prices were relatively stable, but the inflation price that happened under Biden is that big spike that you see in the center. And then it comes back down to something that is much more manageable, the 2.7 and 2.5% under Trump. Consumer sentiment is important, and that's because in consumer sentiment, this is how people make decisions in terms of whether or not they're going to continue to invest in the economy. The University of Michigan does one of the best reports on this, and you can see that it has taken it took a consumer confidence went down underneath Biden from Trump being at a high, but it's now going back down with Trump again. Average hourly wages, this is somewhat of good news, or at least The Economist points it as good news, because wages actually, comparatively, are in a good position today. People are actually making a decent wage. Retail sales are still doing well, and if this continues, The Economist points out that there probably won't be a recession, mainly because if goods are still being purchased, that's going to have a positive effect on what's happening economically. You'll know that it stops at the Trump period because they don't have the data yet in terms of what's happened during the very first few weeks of the Trump administration. This unemployment, again, good news for us. Unemployment's relatively low. I think there are a lot of questions about what's going to happen on unemployment. I was talking to Bob before the show on our construction and home building division. My son has 4 or 5 subdivisions right now that he's in the process of trying to get financed. One of the questions a lender asked him was, are you sure you really want to move forward with this right now? Meaning he views the fact that there's a great amount of instability, specifically in pricing. And you go out and you get a loan, and then all of a sudden prices go up and you can't, you're not going to be able to pay for those goods with the loan that you got. You're going to have to go back out to your equity holders and get more money. If that, in fact, holds true, what's going to happen is some percentage of people looking to move forward with projects are going to put them on hold, and 30% wouldn't be outlandish. That could have a negative effect on this number. Government spending, this is interesting because this is something Bob has spent a lot of time talking about. You can see 2025, 2024, 2023, and even since Donald Trump's inauguration, you can see that we're increasing our spending as opposed to decreasing our spending. With all that we're talking about with Doge and everything else, we're still headed absolutely in the wrong direction. Now, this is one that Trump and the Treasury Secretary, as well as other people in the administration, talk a lot about, because they believe if you can reduce the deficit, you can reduce the 10-year bond. And I think they're right. You will reduce the 10-year bond, and that would have a positive effect on mortgages. But so far, if you look at what just passed with the budget resolution, or what they're proposing with the budget resolution, reducing the deficit still is somewhat illusory. And then here's the last one, and it's the U.S. dollar. If you listen to J.D. Vance, he spends actually a lot of time talking about why the American dollar is too high and it costs us on imports. And there seems to be a little bit of a war going on the American dollar. But of course, that can also have an impact on interest rates, both interest rates that the federal government has to pay, as well as interest rates that we pay as an individual. So all of this brings me to kind of where we are on a variety of issues. But if we can, why don't we start with what just happened with the continuing resolution that passed by the Senate with Minority Leader Schumer coming on board. Bob, could you help us understand the difference between the continuing resolution that passed and what will actually happen with the budget resolution longer term?
Well, the continuing resolution that just passed simply authorized federal government spending for the remainder of this fiscal year, which ends in September. The federal government's fiscal year begins October 1st. So now Congress will turn to passing a budget or some kind of authorization for spending to continue after October 1st. The reconciliation resolution that has passed the House and is pending before the Senate is a process under the Budget Act that was intended to create the kind of sensible budgeting that we've talked about, deciding how much you want to spend, then have the Appropriations Committee come up with specifics as to where the money is going to go, and do it in a timely fashion so you begin the year with a actual budget that's been approved by Congress, signed by the president. That never happens. And the budget reconciliation process has instead become a tool that both parties use when they're in power to avoid a Senate filibuster. Most authorizations of spending, like the continuing resolution that we just endured, is subject to a filibuster. And it was the decision by the Democrats not to filibuster it that enabled it to become law. Well, under the budget reconciliation process, something which conforms with the overall budget resolution isn't subject to a filibuster. So the Republicans want to use that process primarily on the tax side rather than the spending side in order to continue the first year Trump tax cuts, the first term Trump tax cuts, and perhaps others that Trump has proposed without the necessity of getting any Democratic votes to do that. So it's actually a big ploy rather than a sensible budget process. And it's uncertain how the actual spending authority will get enacted to continue the federal government being open after October 1st, whether they will indeed try to pass appropriations bill or whether we will have another continuing resolution, which is entirely possible. But it's not really about budgeting. It's about avoiding the filibuster to cut taxes.
And Bob, about a month ago when we had this discussion on a small debate, you made the point that you saw nothing that was going on in the budgeting process that led you to believe that they actually could get to maybe not a balanced budget, but the deficit being closer to 3% of GDP as opposed to 7%. What are you seeing in terms of what's being proposed today and what finally passed out of the House, as well as the continuing resolution?
Well, the reconciliation framework covers a 10-year period, and what passed the House included a minimum of $1.5 trillion in spending cuts over the next 10 years. If the spending cuts can be increased to $2 trillion, then the amount that's authorized for tax cuts also goes up by $500 million. So there's an aspiration of $2 trillion, but a requirement of $1.5 trillion. Well, that only constitutes $150 billion a year. And the current deficit is $1.9 trillion. So even annually. So it's really not a vow to do anything meaningful about getting federal finances under control.
Man, this discussion has been going on back and forth between the three or four of us since we started the podcast. I'd like to maybe ask Bob whether he thinks that COVID was the turning point for the US deficit, because I remember under the first Trump administration, there was a certain amount of outrage about the tax cuts adding $1 trillion to the federal deficit over a certain long time period. But now it seems like we're adding almost $2 trillion to the deficit every year. And the magnitude of the deficit seems to have sort of changed since the pandemic. Would you say that the pandemic has proven to be the sort of the watershed moment for the escalation of the deficit crisis in the US?
I would. There was a great deal of emergency spending approved first under Trump and then under Biden. Federal spending as a percentage of GDP went from roughly 22% of GDP to nearly 25% of GDP. And then post-COVID, that became the new base. There wasn't a rolling back of the spending. It instead got funneled into the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Act, and under Biden, 24% of GDP became the new base. And there is no indication that the Trump administration wants to return it to 21% or 22% of GDP, which was sort of the historical norm in terms of federal spending as a percentage of GDP, compared to about 18% of GDP for revenue. So there has been for a long time, a chronic deficit and a gap. That got expanded to deal with COVID and never got rolled back.
So Schumer had to make an interesting choice this week, and he's getting pounded by AOC and other Democrats for being willing to be one of I think they needed 6 Democrats to vote for the measure, and they ended up with 10. It's interesting because, to me, I'm not, depending upon what seat you're sitting in would determine whether or not you saw that as being a good idea. I could understand where the conservatives would think they hoped that he didn't sign on, because if he didn't sign on, they were going to be back trying to deal with the budget that they were going to have to get to being closer to balance to be able to keep the conservatives in line. And even then they were going to have some problems, but they'd have to do it with the budget resolution. From the Democratic standpoint, it doesn't seem beyond the Trump administration that if they were to actually not pass a budget, that they would go back in and try to pass a continuing resolution that would just make dramatic draconian cuts and blame it on the Democrats. I think it was the right move from him from a Democratic standpoint, and a right move from him to be able to keep from causing him and his party long-term blame for what was going to happen.
I think a lot of this tactical maneuvering, as you say, is quite unpredictable when it comes down to these sorts of federal government shutdowns or end of the funding for the federal government. There's a lot of partisan maneuvering going back and forth about who's going to be assigned the blame. And I've watched this happen many times since I've lived in the United States, and it's never been clear to me that these sorts of episodes really stick in the minds of Americans. I'd be interested to hear all of your thoughts about this, but I feel like the government shutdowns or the threats of them don't really seem to move the needle. I've never seen a presidential election, for example, where the decisive factor was that there was a government shutdown or almost a government shutdown, right? So I think that a lot of this tactical maneuvering is honestly just about rallying support between different factions within the various political parties or the two political parties, and it doesn't have a big bearing on the big problem of the deficit. I do worry that the American public is in some ways also becoming sort of immune to this debate because the boy that cried wolf problem, where if they keep having these showdowns over the deficit and threatens of government shutdowns, and then it happens every now and then, but it doesn't seem to sort of have catastrophic consequences, that the American public is not going to take this problem seriously any more than it has in the past.
I do believe, going back to the 1990s, that after Republicans took over control of the House in 1994, and Clinton was reeling politically, he kind of got shellacked. I think he called it that in the 1994 elections. Then the Republicans refused to agree on budget spending, and the government shut down. And I think that was a significant contributor to Clinton's political recovery and his ultimate reelection. But I agree that generally it's just become wallpaper. It's just the federal government can't get its act together, and we have these periodic threats of a government shutdown. I think it's important to distinguish what Schumer did and didn't do. And the people who are pounding him from the left are certainly failing to do that. He did not support the continuing resolution. He voted against it. All he did was arrange for it not to be filibustered. Therefore, given the Congress does these things at the last minute, by the time a vote came up, it was either support that resolution or the government shuts down. And if the government shut down, it was completely unpredictable how long that would be. And it is a fact that Democrats care more about the government than Republicans do. So I do think there's a tendency in these things, if there is a shutdown, for the American people instinctively, regardless of what the facts are, to think, well, it's probably the Republicans' fault because we don't think the Democrats really want to shut down the government. And the fairly extraordinary action that Schumer took in terms of, in essence, choosing not to invoke the filibuster, vote for cloture, move to the bill, and then let it pass with 52 Republican votes and only 2 Democratic votes, was an indication of the extent to which Democrats, much more than Republicans, don't want to shut down the government.
Yeah, it seems to me that the Democrats have a harder time and a bigger choice to make. And the one choice is to be a bomb thrower, to just do everything they can to try to light the other side on fire. And the other side is kind of what James Carville is advocating. Hey, they're running the government, whether you like it or not. They have control over the House, the Senate, the presidency, and for that matter, at the Supreme Court, they have an extreme amount of pull. Let them do their thing. And then when they do their thing, there will be problems that come from it. But that seems to me to be the choice. I've been listening to a couple of others on their podcast. I don't know if you have listened to any of them, but certainly one of them is Bernie Sanders. Now, Bernie Sanders, I think, is really cultivating a message. I don't like his message, but he's cultivating a message of there's just no way that these oligarchs who are now running your government, who are now making these decisions, are going to do what's in your best interest. They're going to do what's in their best interest. I don't like that because to me, it's just, it divides us up even further. And the reality is, if we're going to solve this problem, it's going to take something from all of us to be able to participate. But I think that message is going to resonate, and I think it's going to be one of the strongest messages out there. Now, on the other hand, if you listen to the governor of California, Gavin, he's been having on, like we've been doing, Henry, he's been having on people from the right. He had Steve Bannon, I believe, the other day on his podcast. And his goal, or it seems to be his goal, is to actually spend time reviewing where maybe he's been in error. By the way, I think Gavin, like him or dislike him, is maybe one of the best politicians on the scene today. He is an extraordinary politician. I'm not saying, again, that you have to like him, but if you watch him, you listen to him speak, he's come out of these fires with his popularity numbers actually being higher, and I'd have swore they were going to be lower. But nonetheless, what do you think the right response is for the Democratic Party to all the things that are taking place? How would you approach it?
Well, there certainly is anger on the left and a desire for somebody to do something. But the problem is that the Trump administration is saying congressional enactments don't matter. It doesn't matter what they say we need to spend. It doesn't matter what they say about what agencies ought to exist or not exist. So until the courts rein that in, there's really nothing that can be done from a congressional level that will have an effect. They did have a choice here. They could have shut down the government and made demands that Doge be reined in. But I think that would have been an imprudent decision politically. The Democratic Party has sort of been united in behind a vision, very largely implemented under the Biden administration, of turning the United States into a European-style social democracy. I think that the loss to Trump will facilitate at least some degree of reconsideration and maybe a wider range of opinion within the Democratic Party. And I think Carville is mostly right. I think Trump 2 is going to play even worse than Trump 1. And after 2 years of Donald Trump in 2018, the Democrats picked up over 40 House seats. And by 2020, they had control of the presidency in both chambers of Congress. I don't think Trump 2 is going to play as well as that, based upon the way things are headed. So I think in politics, particularly over the last 30 years, just being the other guy has been a very successful political strategy. But I do believe that there is room for discussion within the Democratic Party as to whether we continue down the pathway that we've been following of trying to fundamentally change the political economy of the United States, or whether there's room within the party for what used to be called New Democrats. Clinton was a good example of it, that governed more from the center left and sort of accepted the political economy of the United States as being highly successful, and we just need to do a better job of maybe directing it a little bit and having a broader social welfare base.
Yeah, I like that, the just being the other guy. I'm in business with 5 of my 9 brothers and sisters, and it seems like all the time they're coming to me and telling me, well, this other guy said, and I keep telling them, I want to meet this other guy. Where is this other guy? But Henry, your thoughts on the right move for Democrats politically on this?
Yeah, I love the line. The other guy, it also brings to mind the saying that you should never interrupt your opponent while he's in the middle of making a mistake, right? Which would sort of suggest that the Democrats' best strategy at the moment, which may have been what Schumer was doing, is just stay out of the spotlight, let the Trump administration have all the attention they want for the foreseeable future. The other thing I would say is Bernie Sanders is great entertainment. And, he normally goes on about millionaires and billionaires. So when he talks about oligarchs, I'm not sure if there's a difference. Maybe that's just the billionaires, not the millionaires anymore. But, Bernie's not going to be a presidential nominee, let alone the president of the United States. So I'm thinking maybe we can just ignore what Bernie Sanders says. Or maybe just imagine he's like one of the guys from the Muppets or something, because he's got that great hair and the glasses and he's got that great accent. He's a great figure for Saturday Night Live or something. I think the more serious heads in the Democratic Party should, A, follow the Schumer strategy, stay out of the spotlight, don't get in the way while the Republicans are doing whatever Trump wants, potentially to their detriment, potentially not, who knows, but give them a lot of rope and see if they hang themselves with it. But I do think that the more sensible heads do have to put some thought into working out why working class Americans have turned their backs on the Democratic Party. This low-income voters are basically how they win elections. They like to talk about a multi-ethnic coalition, and that's true. But we saw this election and the first Trump election in 2016 that when broadly lower classes, the working classes turn away from them, they just lose. So I think that they're going to have to put some thought into working out why working class Americans have sort of turned their backs on them. And so if Newsom is having people like Bannon on the show to talk about these issues, it's probably going to be instructive for them. Whether they can really put their heads to that sort of message and really engage with those sorts of constituencies anymore, I'm not sure, right? Because the Democratic Party has become very much a creature of relatively wealthy, highly educated people who are probably more likely to sympathize with the Columbia protesters than with working class voters. That's a problem for them. But maybe they don't need to do much. Maybe they just need to tweak their messaging a little bit. Maybe they just need a different messenger, and then they can bring enough of those working class voters, low income voters back into the fold at the midterms, and that'll be enough for them to put the brakes on the Trump administration. So I think the Democrats are in an interesting spot. If they listen too much to Bernie Sanders, they're not going to do themselves any favors.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. If they don't have the opportunity right now to make the waves, but they do have the opportunity to ride them. One of the things that I'm watching as I listen to podcasts from a variety of different points of view and listening to a lot of the business people who are defending Trump on anything, everything. It doesn't matter what he does, they're defending him. What you find is that there's this narrative that's beginning to develop. And I love to listen to him because I know where they stole it from, but nonetheless, it's, we're more about Main Street than we are Wall Street. We don't really care about the stock market. The stock market's not what matters. What matters is how it is that you're helping people on Main Street. And getting the 10-year note down is the single biggest thing that you can do to try to revamp how this works. And then they talk about all the other things that the Trump administration is doing to put pressure on the top level. Now, of course, what that's assuming is the following. It's assuming that, we do these tariffs. And if we do these tariffs, it's going to be inflationary, cause higher prices for people who have to buy the products, potentially cost some of them their jobs as more people are laying people off, potentially cause a recession, and somehow or another, magically, that becomes a big assist to Main Street over Wall Street. It's bullshit. That's all it is, right? At least in my opinion. It's trying to, they're attempting to justify their guy based upon something that they would never justify for a Democrat, ever. They wouldn't even think of doing it. The real issue is that these divisions that exist oftentimes between us economically, I really bring this back to we're all sitting in the same rather small, narrow rowboat together. And as much as we may not like the guy sitting at the other end of this boat, if he submerges, you pay part of the price as well. There's an important role here for us to recognize. Certainly Main Street matters, But you're out of your mind if you think Wall Street doesn't matter. You're out of your mind if you think losing $5 trillion in the stock market has zero effect on the guy sitting on Main Street. Any event, that to me is, if they ride the wave, they go ahead and allow them to make their case, and they begin to box them in.
Wall Street, publicly traded companies, employ a very large number of people and are responsible for a large share of economic output. Their investments are a significant part of what drives the future. And when you have a lack of confidence being expressed by declining stock prices, that's not only significant in what it says about a judgment on the policies that are inducing that, it means that there's less capital available for publicly traded companies to make investments to create opportunities for the future. Main Street and Wall Street are both important. And it isn't a matter of crying crocodile tears over the brokers that place the stocks. These are the values of companies that employ millions of people. So trying to generate class resentment to try to reduce the political damage from enacting policies that cause a lack of confidence in the investing class and a reduction in capital available for redeployment is political demagoguery of the worst sort. You're right, Paul. The sharp difference that people make between Wall Street and Main Street simply doesn't exist when you deal with economic reality. And it's not just the folks in the big consulting firms or the big brokerage firms that are hurt by this reduction in share prices.
Yeah, and it can be even simpler, which is take a look at your 401k value. Right? There are a whole bunch of people who have 401ks, and they're depending upon that for their retirement. They're connected. And at the same time, I would say to Wall Street, hey, you can't abandon labor either. I mean, you can't abandon people who are on Main Street. There is a connection between them.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think that it's not just absolutely not accurate that regular working Americans are not feeling the pinch at the moment. All of the consumer sentiment surveys out there that are being reported recently show that people are not feeling confident about the economy. There's all sorts of data coming out that people are cutting back on fast food purchases, that they're reducing their supermarket spends at the end of the month as they run out of food. Sorry, not out of food, out of ready cash, that they're cutting expenses where they can, which is obviously not a good sign for the economy either. So I think that trying to make the argument that the Wall Street ructions are completely dislocated from the rest of the economy is not accurate either. I think that a lot of what's going on Wall Street also is reflecting some more fundamental uncertainty about the trajectory of the economy, even among working people.
All right, so what I find also to be interesting that's taking place today is there seems to be significant changes that are happening in a variety of different orders that exist. Certainly, the world order seems to be changing with Trump's position on Ukraine and NATO. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But I also see it happening in simple things like economics. There's an attempt to try and readjust what GDP means. It's fascinating. I had a professor named Francis Bader at Harvard University who, I remember when he used to walk in, he would explain to us GDP, but he would walk in with his cane and a little box that he would then project at 200 or 300 students. And he told us, he said, I'm going to tell you in one day more about what GDP means than anything you would have learned in all your years at business school. And he said, because I invented it. You can look him up. He actually was one of the people who invented it, very old guy at the time. And he says, I invented it for Lyndon Johnson. And he says, I'm going to tell you why. He says, because that was the dumbest son of a bitch I ever ran into in my entire life. And he goes, and I had to teach him how to think about the economy. So we invented GDP, but it was just a formula. And he took the formula and he added it up and said, look, if these things happen, it should equal a certain percentage rise in GDP, military spending, state and local spending, what's taking place with personal consumption power. And by doing that, if you're not, you can start to see where you can get out of hand on inflation if you spend too much in government. Now, what's fascinating is that Trump is looking at removing governmental spending from GDP. Now, I think the thinking behind that, I'm not sure, but I think his thinking is that reflects more of a view of how he sees the economy, which is wealth creation and private sector innovation. But he's also changing groups like the federal FESAC, I think it's called, but it's the board of people who are administrators who actually try and help determine the statistics that we're putting out on a regular basis. And the thought is he's trying to cook the books. He's trying to create a set of books that when a recession does happen, it won't be reflected. Nonetheless, when you start hearing economists starting to complain, many conservative economists who actually liked him, I find that to be interesting because the cheese is being moved everywhere.
Now, changing the metrics that you're being measured by is an absolutely wonderful tactic for trying to project success. Anytime anyone tries to change the metrics, I always get uneasy. I hadn't actually heard that Trump was trying to remove government spending from the GDP statistics. I'm not surprised. I don't think that he'll have much success with that. I think that a lot of agencies will probably continue to report a different GDP statistic, even if he's got some report that takes it out. But he's not the first person to have this idea. Over the last 20 years or so, there's been a big move, mostly on the left, actually, against the notion of economic growth, against the notion that economic growth is good. And the British Central Bank for a certain time started collecting an alternative measure of well-being that included things like health outcomes and even some subjective well-being data, where they would take a representative sample of the country and ask them, I guess, how good they were feeling. And if some of them had just been patting their dog before they picked up the phone, then they probably felt great. And then others, if, they just stubbed their toe on the kitchen corner, maybe felt terrible. And so maybe the statistics got skewed by crazy stuff like that. But there's been a move against using material output as a true measure for the economy for a long time, mostly from the left. So I'm not really surprised to hear that people from the right have decided to get in on the act and say that, hey, yeah, we can change the numbers too if we want to try and get the sort of results that we want. It's not a good idea. It's better to keep these things stable so that everyone can compare GDP growth to last month and last year so that we can actually get some sort of a handle on what's going on in the economy. But I'm not really surprised because this has been going on for quite some time.
The Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is the entity whose advisory council the Trump administration is trying to throw out, is one of the most useful organs and one of the most honest custodians of the numbers in all of the federal government. And it would be a very great loss for the country if the Bureau's work became politicized. There's already a measure of the private sector economy independent of government spending. If Trump wants to argue that that is the more relevant number, and I think there's a good argument for looking at that independently of government spending, that number already exists. And given the fact that federal government spending is highly stimulative right now, eliminating, I don't think, would have the effect that he thinks that it will have. It's likely to reduce the measured performance of the economy, particularly since there's no indication that Trump's actually going to try to do something about the deficit and make federal spending less stimulative.
Good point. All right. So last issue, I went to a great play this weekend. It was a play that was a monologue given by a guy who was Winston Churchill. And he was giving an address or a talk to a group of alumni at Oxford University. And he was just talking about world history. The guy did an amazing job in this play. For 2 hours, he talked about all the events that Winston Churchill was involved with as if he was Winston Churchill. And it really was done in a fabulous way. One of my favorite parts of the play, though, that really struck me was there was this part where Winston, the actor, Winston said that he went to an event and met this young Democratic senator who had written this book that he gave him a copy of. It was called While England Slept. And of course, the book was about the concept of appeasement, what had happened with appeasement. And Winston went into this dialogue about how the challenge that people have is they don't understand the difference between a peace deal and an appeasement deal. He said they're very different. And he said what Neville didn't understand was he was the one being appeased. He was the one being delayed. Now, again, I've listened to lots of different information in the last couple of weeks, and I've gotten a variety of different perspectives on Trump. There are some people who really think Trump is in Vladimir Putin's pocket and he can't stand up to him. There are other people who believe that he's just trying to find peace. But the one thing that is becoming to me more clear is that this appeasement deal, I can't imagine he's not smart enough to know that if you delay this, that there are benefits that can come to the Kremlin. It's happening at the exact same time when people like his new director of intelligence is actually firing people who've worked in trying to do intelligence gathering on the Russians. It seems to me there really is a game change going on in his mind. There's a new world order that he is trying to put together. Now, I don't like that world order because I kind of like the last one. I think the last one worked. But the motive matters. And it matters because on one hand, it could just simply be a mistake. On the other hand, it could be something where he's just corrupt. And then there's this third way, which is, no, it's actually their view. They actually don't like the American allies. They actually like the strongmen that exist in the world. I'd love to have your all thoughts on this, how you see this.
I think that underlying a lot of the Trump administration's drive to end the conflict in Ukraine is also a desire, which has been shared with pretty much every administration since Obama. The big desire to try and shift the United States' strategic focus to the Western Pacific and to China. And I think that you have to take that into account. I'm not saying that that's the only thing at play, but I do think that's part of what they're trying to do. And if you think about an American public that's increasingly isolationist and less willing to bear the burdens of big forward deployments of US troops, of big expenditure on defense, and you think, okay, where are the most capable American partners that could plausibly do more themselves? Immediately, you think of Europe. And so, in principle, the idea that the Europeans should do more to defend themselves and Ukraine, that the conflict with Russia should be defused so that the United States can pivot to balancing China and East Asia, I don't think that's a stupid idea at all. I think it's probably a good idea. Now, is that the great big strategic shift with the new world order that's coming into view? Honestly, Paul, I don't know. And if that is where they're trying to move, are they doing it in a particularly smart way by antagonizing the Europeans, by alarming them tremendously, by kind of insulting or humiliating Zelensky in the White House, et cetera, et cetera? I wouldn't say that they're doing a particularly good job on that front either, but from the really big picture view, you can see a justification for making this pivot especially given the fact that Trump has run on a more isolationist platform and Biden ran on a more pro-Ukraine platform and Trump won. I just don't think the American public is that willing to support that level of American military spending.
Let me push back on that a little bit and get your thoughts on this. So that was one of the things that I thought, okay, maybe we're trying to change and isolate China. But if you're going to isolate China, you don't go upsetting every ally you have. That doesn't make any sense. You don't go put tariffs on all of the people who are your supporters. You don't start talking about making Canada a 51st state and bringing Greenland in and going out and sending the military out to Panama. That's not what you do if you're trying to focus on China. Now, I can't imagine he's that dumb. I mean, because if you're trying to focus on China, that is a dumb strategy that he's imposing. A smarter strategy would be to divide and conquer. I think the strategy's trying to do something else. Now, again, that's assuming that this isn't all just a mistake, that he doesn't know what he's doing. I think he actually has a different view of the world order. And again, tackle that if you would. I appreciate the pushback on it.
So I don't see a lot of strategic coherence everywhere, Paul. I think it's possible that what's going on is going on in a piecemeal way where there's a lot of also ad hoc, immediate decision-making, looking for immediate results that don't necessarily always match up with a big strategic vision. I was just trying to lay out a kind of, I guess, best-case scenario defense of what the Trump administration is doing and something that I think that Americans might support. Whether that's being followed all the time, I mean, I don't think so, to be perfectly honest. And that's one of the things that people find confusing. I think that's one of the things that allies are finding very confusing, is that all the pieces don't fit together. That could also be the nature of what's going on, right? Is that Trump takes a relatively narrow view of America's self-interest. It doesn't include formal institutionalization of any of this stuff. It doesn't include a formal long-range whole of government strategic approach to any of these problems, but that he moves kind of in a crab-like way, sometimes forward, sometimes back, sometimes left, sometimes right, towards a vague goal. And it's just really hard to make total sense of it.
Bob, I'd love to have your thoughts on this, but you know, let me add just something before we do. I know that there's data out there that says Americans are becoming more isolationist, but there's also data, depending upon how you ask the questions. Americans take a great deal of pride in knowing that there is an American world order. They take a great deal of pride. Zelensky, you know, when Trump began to attack him, I had no doubt that I thought at the time 80% of the Republicans would turn on Zelensky. That really didn't happen. 50% did. But the other 50% of Republicans said, we don't really need to be doing that. I don't think most Republicans think it's a great idea to invade Greenland. I think most Republicans don't think that it's a great idea for us to be hitting Canada every single chance we get. I think they're tribal, just like Democrats are. They're going to support their guy regardless. They want to look like they're supporting their guy. They want to look loyal. But I don't think they are isolationist. I really don't believe. I think if that's what Trump believes is the mood of Americans, that's the mood of Steve Bannon. But I don't see that as being the mood of most Americans. Your thoughts on the things that Henry said, and as well as the isolationist issue?
I don't believe that there is a strategic overlay to anything that Trump does, and particularly not on foreign policy. But I think his instinct, his impulse, is towards the great power politics of the 19th century. And he finds it understandable that Putin would want a neutered, neutralized, subservient Ukraine, and doesn't see an American interest in thwarting Putin in achieving that, and in fact sees an interest in stopping the fighting before it costs the United States more or brings us more deeply into the conflict. I don't think that his instinctive great power politics view of foreign policy fits the American spirit any more than a highly interventionist foreign policy does. For Trump, it is irrelevant that the Ukrainians want to join democratic Europe and join the free world, as it historically has been called. Americans, I think, see ourselves on the side of democracy and free markets and free people. We can have large-scale disagreements as to how active we should be and what risks we should take in promoting or defending those values in other countries. But I think that there's a broad consensus among the American people that that's the side we're on. That's who we root for. And to the extent we do anything, it is to advance those values in other countries. So I think his approach of the great powers dividing the world and having their own spheres of influence is at odds with the views of Americans about our role in the world.
Henry, in terms of how Americans see themselves, that's one issue. But if you are going to go back to this great power leadership role that potentially creates fears, and Russia's in charge of one and we're in charge of the other, even if that is the idea, I can't imagine that the rest of the world doesn't just go along with our thought on that they're going to react differently, and that maybe we've been underestimating, maybe Europe has been underestimating themselves over the last 20 years by not funding a military, by not having a good defense. I noticed Poland this week talked about trying to have a strategic nuclear defense, and I'm not sure exactly what that results in, whether that means they want to have their own or the French to provide it for them. But it's pretty clear to me they don't trust the Americans to do that for them any longer. What are your thoughts about how this is going to play out in the rest of the world? Where does everyone else start to go? You know, we've had these, I've always liked the Five Eyes, which is the United States, Canada, England, New Zealand, and Australia in intelligence. This idea that there was a great amount of cooperation. I can't imagine that even that's under threat today, that there are interests now in those other four groups that are counter to the United States, and they're going to be looking at it from a completely different viewpoint. Anyway, your thoughts on where you think the rest of the world starts to go?
I think once you start to remove the American security backstop to countries like Germany, Poland, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, then you start to get unpredictable results. And this is why I think that one should take a broader view of the American self-interest and not see things in such a one-shot game, look for immediate gains for the United States like Trump does, look to bilateral relations always instead of trying to build institutions. I think that the institutions that the US set up after World War II, including NATO, but also the security guarantees for Japan and South Korea and other places, were a very effective way for the US to project influence in a durable way, even if it meant that the US had to commit significant resources overseas for a long time. So I think there are going to be unpredictable results of removing America's protective handover from a lot of these countries. We've talked before about the prospects of rearmament in Germany and Poland. It's a little alarming for any scholar of European history, to be perfectly frank, to think about a nuclear-armed Germany sitting between a nuclear-armed Poland and France, with a nuclear-armed Russia sitting off to the east. I think it was better when America was providing that nuclear umbrella for those Western European countries. So, you know, the economists like to say it's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. And I would say the same thing about national security and about international relations. But But if this post-World War II order with the United States leadership was marked by a certain sense of stability, right, especially structured by the great power competition between the US and the Soviet Union, I think that if the United States starts to draw back its security guarantees for its allies, plus we see the rise of a multi-power world with not just China, but also India and Russia starting to become more independent, the consequences of that are really probably very difficult to foresee.
So, Bob, I'll give you the last comment here. I saw a good movie this weekend. It's called Black Bag, and it's a movie about an intelligence agency, the MI6, in England. And it's a fascinating story. It's a fun story. It's all fictional, obviously. It was, by the way, done mostly before Trump got into office. So the story, they were evolving long before he got there, but it still had an interesting play. And the play was, you're trying to figure out, you have all these intelligence officers who are all in disagreement with one another. The reason they call it the black bag is that anytime you do something that you can't tell anyone else about, you say, oh, that's in the black bag. And of course, that means you can put all kinds of things in the black bag and nobody really knows what the other person is doing. And that kind of works from the higher administration standpoint, because they have people doing all different types of things that they don't want them to know what the other people are doing. So it turns out they find this new product which can kill 14 million people without a nuclear bomb, and they make a decision. The highest leader makes a decision inside the MI6 to give it to the Russians, because they want the Russians to use it against the Americans, so the Americans will come back in and be supportive of what's happening in the war. Now, again, this was done before Trump got into power. But what's fascinating about the story is, we have now this fragmentation that is happening amongst intelligence agencies around the world. Their interests are different than our interests. Our intelligence agencies have done a lot of nefarious things over time in the protection of liberty and the protection of us. They may have been wrong, but nonetheless, that was what their goal was. What I find to be fascinating is that we also are having divisions on those issues here in the United States, with the intelligence director having divisions amongst the people that she's keeping and she's letting go. But the point I guess I'm giving is, it seems like there are a lot of potential unintended consequences to this. This is not even a theory. At best, what we're doing around the world today, what he is trying to do today around the world, is a hypothesis. And we have no real ability to be able to gauge where it's going to go.
I agree with that analysis, and I agree about the unpredictability that Henry was referring to. But we've crossed the threshold. And I believe that we will see some kind of realignment that occurs. And I think it will be in part other countries trying to structure their own security capabilities and enhance them, and in part accommodating more whatever the regional power or threat to them may be. If I were Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, I would have zero confidence that what Trump is doing in Ukraine is so that he can be tougher with Xi when it comes time to address China. My guess is that he treats Xi very much in the same way that he treats Putin in terms of geopolitics. Maybe a little bit more sternly when it comes to trade, because China is a country with which we have a significant trade deficit. Russia doesn't have enough of an economy to worry about. So I think we are going to see, while it may be better, and I might debate that, if the United States had retained its position as the glue behind the geopolitics of the world order, those days are over. And we're headed towards geopolitical realignments of various sorts all over the globe.
I'd say one thing in response to Bob. I think Bob's right that some sort of a threshold has been crossed. But I think the one thing that perhaps the Trump administration doesn't appreciate is the role of time, because there's a significant lag between the Allies realizing their growing insecurity because of the Americans and actually doing anything about it, especially in military procurement. Even the European Union, they've said they're going to allow Eurobonds for procurement. The Germans are talking about revising their constitution to allow for deficit spending for security investment. That period of time is going to take them to get any of that up and running. I'd say corresponds potentially quite nicely to the rest of the Trump administration. About 4 years, I would say. Then they will be starting to see significant returns on their military investments. What Trump perhaps underestimates is the potential that a Democratic president comes in just as these investments are starting to bear fruit and is able to reach a new grand bargain with Europe that Trump has no control over. Essentially, that Trump starts a process and train that he cannot control once he leaves office. I think that that's something that the Trump administration potentially doesn't appreciate, is the lag between breaking the American security guarantees now and how long it takes for things to really have effects overseas among the allies.
Help me understand when you're saying that. Play that out. How does that become a negative from his standpoint?
Well, presuming that right now, say the German government starts this process of reforming their constitution to be able to spend huge amounts more on defense. And I think they're talking about this as something they are dead set on doing, the new government. So then they start to place orders after, 6 months or a year when they've gotten this constitutional amendment through. They start to place orders for drones and tanks and artillery and ammunition, and they start increasing the number of troops that they are recruiting, and they bring back in national service, and they do all of these things and make Germany a much, much more militarily capable power. But that doesn't happen this year or next year. That happens in 3 or 4 years. And then Trump is out of office and a new president comes in and is confronted with a new reality of new partners in Europe that are completely transformed in their military capabilities. That new president has a tremendous amount of influence to be able to reshape relations with Europe, a newly strong Europe, in a way that Trump is not going to have. He's not going to be able to reshape relations with those partners as they are going to exist in the future.
The reason why I think we've crossed a threshold in that, even if the scenario that Henry propounded occurs, the United States is not going to be trusted to play a central security guarantee role anymore. Not because we elected Trump once, but because we elected him twice. And I don't think that in the future we will be trusted to have the kind of continuity in leadership commitment to that role that we had for 50 years post World War II. That, I think, is gone forever.
Yeah, and there are going to be downsides and there will be upsides to that. I think the downside is it is gone forever. Our ability to be able to control the whole destiny of the world, which we've really been in that seat to be able to do, I think that's going to be removed from us. At the same time, I think that Europe is going to gain an incredible amount of military strength. I think they're going to stand up for their survival. There's that old analogy of, if you want to make certain that a frog will die inside your boiling water, just turn the heat up real slow. Well, that's not what they've done. They've just cranked this thing right up to the top, and the frog jumps out of the boiling water. I think what's going to happen with Europe is not only are they going to create a new ability to confront the enemy, they're going to create a divided front to confront the enemy. And so we're going to be worried about what Poland is doing in future years, what Germany is doing in future years, what France is doing in future years. And this isn't going to be a bipolar world or a four-polar world where there's the Middle East, there's China, there's Europe and Russia, and the North and South America. What I think is going to happen is we're going to be as fragmented as we were all the way back during the period of realpolitik. As you said, though, we've already crossed the threshold, so we're going to get to kind of watch what happens. Gentlemen, thank you very much. I appreciate you being here today.
Good to be with you.
Thanks, Paul.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.